I'm Professor David Chandler. I work at the University of Westminster in London, and I'm a professor of international relations. And I'm here at the Czernin Security Forum, and we're discussing resilience and hybridity and security issues in Europe. I'm personally not sure what resilience exactly is. You can read different definitions. People sometimes argue that resilience is about bouncing back from trauma or stresses, crises and problems. Some people sort of argue that it's more of a process and an ongoing way of relating and seeing issues and dealing with them slightly differently. Not so much a one-off approach, but maybe an iterative or ongoing or continual way of dealing with issues. But one thing that we can say for sure about resilience is that it seems to be a range of discussions, or maybe it's a field of thinking which is trying to move away from traditional, or sometimes it's called top-down approaches. And in some ways, this field of thinking is quite challenging to traditional ways of thinking about power as a very centralized and directive approach. Resilience tends to say that no matter how powerful you are, or how good your ideas are, or how many resources you might have, it's not that easy to address and solve problems. The reason for that is that problems are different. And so something that might have worked at one point might not work in a different context or at a different time. And as problems become more differentiated, it becomes much more difficult to think of problem solving in traditional and hierarchical ways. So I guess discussions about how we can achieve resilience depend a lot on what we understand resilience to be. So more traditional approaches would see resilience as a sort of property, and that some people or some communities are more resilient than others. And in those more traditional approaches, we achieve resilience by giving resources, education, training, however we imagine the thing that we should be resilient to. We can obviously think in fairly traditional ways about strengthening capacities to cope and to manage and to bounce back. For some other people, it doesn't really make so much sense to think of resilience as a property that an entity or a community has, because especially today, when we don't really know exactly the nature of the threats or the crises or the problems, it's much more difficult to think about the resources or the money or the education that you need to have. So you might be very resilient to one particular thing, maybe, I don't know, food crises or environmental issues, but you might be not very resilient to another sort of thing. So it's very, very difficult. There's a lot of discussion, how do we measure it as if it's a thing or a property of a community, an individual, whatever. So for other people, they argue that to be resilient or to enable people to be resilient, we need to sort of move away from understanding it as something that can be given or something that can be counted. So being resilient is more a matter of an approach to the world. So then we might ask, what is that approach to the world? And often people argue that it's a more open approach to the world. That when we're sort of thinking that there's a particular threat or a particular measurement of security, we tend to not look at other things. And it's normally the things that we're not thinking about or not looking at, which eventually emerges as the key problem. So if it was a different way of approaching and of seeing the world, it's then a question of attentiveness, responsivities, those sorts of things. And so very often a resilient community in policy discourses is seen as a community that's self-governing, not self-governing in a traditional way of voting and these sorts of things, but self-governing as in being able to adapt or to modulate itself in relationship to its environment and its surroundings. And in that sense, things aren't really threats or crises in traditional ways, because if you're sensitive enough, you can sort of adapt with them rather than crisis and response. So one way of thinking about it might be when you're trying to swat a fly with a newspaper or whatever. And the fly is more sensitive. You know, it sees and senses the air. It's already moved well before your newspaper actually touches it. And you could understand resilience approaches as enabling us to be more like a fly, better able to see and to sense things. So it's not like a war just happens. We understand wars as processes. They start off small and they evolve or they emerge. And so if we could see the process in its emergence, then we can adapt and respond. So it's not so much as before and after a conflict. It's understanding the world in much more processual, gradual and emergent ways, and then having a process of responding in this sort of approach. And that creates quite a different approach to traditional ways of thinking about security. I'm not sure that anything is particularly important for particular places, but the discussion of resilience seems to be more important in Europe than in other places. And as we're all aware, recently the European Union has taken up resilience as a key word in policy documents. So I think the question to ask is why is the word or the term resilience increasingly useful in policy documents, and what might it tell us about the world and about the European Union? And as I intimated earlier, I think it tells us that the world or Europe or the European Union is rethinking how to do policy or how to present its policy, maybe less as a one-off solution, maybe less as a way of giving things, whether it's resources or whatever, and more of a promoting a way of working that's more interested in stability, working with processes rather than against them. And I think that's quite difficult for the EU to manage in a logical way, because I think that the European Union was initially set up with a very liberal, rationalist, universal sort of ethic where it was really based on reasoning, overcoming petty interests, being objective, having a correct approach so you could tell people what to do. You knew the answers to everything because it was in knowing the answers and having the resources that legitimized the EU having influence over its neighbors. And a resilience approach where one size doesn't fit all, you don't know the answers, you can't just give people solutions, is something that would go very much against the grain of a very hierarchical, self-satisfied approach that the EU often has. So for many times when we're at policy discussions, resilience seems to be a word that's used, but it's not really understood and it can't really sort of develop. It just seems like we could have used another word instead. It's not always clear what is resilience doing and what are the implications of using this word for the European Union. You can see how it might be useful for the European Union leaders to say, well, we can't solve problems anymore and all the rest of it, but you can't really see the positives that come out of a shift towards resilience.